Hello and welcome to Cyber Secure Ed, Canada's only cybersecurity podcast, and it's all about education, public education primarily. This is our final show of the season, and I've got Stephen Hurley coming out from behind the curtains. He's been fantastic at making things work and recording things and digitizing our 10 episodes, which make for a really cool collection. So I'm excited about the body of work that we've built here. With us today, we have very special guests. We've got Chad Marlow, Senior Advocacy and Policy Counsel from the ACLU. Hello, Chad. Is Chad muted?
No,
I think
not.
he is.
No, he's not. I heard.
And
oh, wait a minute. Sorry, Chad. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm here. It's nice to be with you.
There you are. Welcome. We also have Valerie Steeves, who's a criminology professor at the University of Ottawa, and she's the co-leader of the eGirls project and a number of other very cool initiatives with Jane Bailey, the professor of law, also at the University of Ottawa, and they're the co-creators of the Equality project. They're really passionate about privacy and human rights. And welcome, Valerie and Jane.
Hi. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks.
There you are. This is great. So our show today, we'll talk about a number of things. We'll talk about monetizing student data. We'll talk about the false dichotomy between monetizing student data and the kinds of growth that EdTech companies are expecting. We'll talk about whether this is in fact an inflection point in the adoption of education technology, especially in light of the pandemic that we're going through. But before we start on all that, can you give us an idea, Valerie and or Jane, what the Equality Project is all about?
The Equality Project is a partnership of academic researchers, civil society groups, teachers, and youth themselves. And we're really interested in better understanding how young people experience privacy and equality in network spaces, and also connecting those experiences and giving them voice in the policy debate. So a lot of our work focuses on putting policymakers into contact with young people, so we adults have a better understanding of how technology is actually playing out in their lives.
Fascinating. And so what made you decide to work together with Jane?
That's a great question. Jane and I are dear friends, and I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about working with Jane is that we share this really incredibly strong commitment to thinking very critically about the way commercialism is affecting the environment for young people. As a social scientist, it's really a pleasure to work with a lawyer. I'm a lawyer by training, but Jane is a law professor. And that really gives us an opportunity to connect those voices of young people that we were talking about earlier with policymakers. So I think that's really one of the unique opportunities we have working together.
Fascinating. And I think, Chad, you'll agree that this is extremely interesting, especially in light of your work with the ACLU.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's a unique and fascinating time, which seems to be a dramatic understatement in the world that we live in right now. But, if you take us back 6 months ago, we were definitely at a point with EdTech companies and the attempt to make EdTech hardware and software more prevalent in teaching students. We were at a point where we were having some serious discussions about where privacy kind of fits into that scheme and how important it is to protect privacy. But today, fast forward into the COVID-19 world in which we live, and we've seen something dramatic and unprecedented happen, which is to say that we had an industry that, viewed kind of writ large, is still in its early stages, achieve something close to 100% market penetration in a matter of weeks. And so what was a concern about the future has been, time warped into a really pressing concern about the present.
Yeah. And are you seeing that the adoption of EdTech has, in fact, accelerated because suddenly EdTech companies have gone to school boards, school districts, and said, you know what, our technology was built especially for this, and now's the time for you to adopt it. Is that generally the proposition? Is that what's happening?
In some respects, it's happening the other way around. The schools are saying, oh my God, we cannot teach students in a physical environment anymore. Help us. Anyone help us. And the EdTech companies are rushing in saying, we are your solution. And the rapidity at which the EdTech solutions are being adopted by the schools is literally a matter of days, because the schools are so desperate for anything that will enable them to teach remotely that they are in no way pumping the brakes on issues like privacy.
Jane, I would love to have your thoughts on this, because here in Canada, we always say that maybe our security laws are not as stringent, but we certainly lead from a privacy law perspective. And when I look at the FERPAs and the PPRA and the COPAs that the U.S. has, how do you feel that we are positioned here in Canada to protect children and students' personal information or privacy?
Well, it's kind of interesting in Canada because we do have federal and provincial generalized privacy legislation. But one of the questions that arose for our project a long time before COVID-19 was the degree to which schools, teachers, educators in general really had any idea about the privacy implications of the EdTech tools that they were using. So you can have legislation, but if people aren't aware of the privacy implications of the tools that they're using, the legislation just sort of sits there. And so for people to understand what their ongoing obligations are, is one thing, and then for them to understand that that technology is having an impact on that is another. And unfortunately, I think that I happen to live with an educator in the public school system, and so he's been hearing me a lot lately say, if you guys had just not treated privacy advocates like a bunch of lunatics and listened to us when we said, the technology you're using, you have no idea of the implications of, we wouldn't now be scrambling in a time when we've got basically almost full penetration of these technologies in schools, now trying to figure out, well, what are the privacy implications of these technologies?
There certainly isn't enough time to conduct PIAs for everything, and I wish there was more sharing of privacy impact analysis, because there's such a need to have a coordinated effort to understand and to baseline the privacy implications all this EdTech to support a diversity of educational institutions, and so a few weeks ago we had the director of education at the Halton School Board here with us, and he talked to us about how they use a catalog-based approach to the technology that is allowed in their school board, the technology that is under review, and the technology that under no circumstances is allowed on their systems and on kids' what are now Chromebooks, because so many school boards are handing out Chromebooks so students can remain in touch with their teachers. Stephen Hurley, who's created this voice ed podcasting platform that we're connected through right now, has unique perspectives as an educator, because years ago, perhaps it feels like months, he was a teacher, and now he's in touch with educators from all over Canada. And Stephen, I wonder what your perspectives are between the way things were versus how they are now, in light of the fact that there's this active pressure to use education technology, not just because of the pandemic, but just in general as an evolutionary step towards what's been called modernizing education.
Well, thanks, Claudio. I have an octopus of feelings about this. I mean, there's tentacles coming out of my body every which way. But I remember, and I think we were reflecting with Tim King. I was an itinerant curriculum and technology resource teacher. It was a role that I made up for myself in the 1990s, and it turned into a whole team of consultants for the district I was working with. We were really pushing, trying to get teachers to integrate technology into their classrooms, into their programs. But we were dealing with things like spreadsheets and databases and multimedia design tools. Heck, the internet was just a couple of years old. We were still using Netscape Navigator. So a lot of these concerns really weren't on our radar. And so fast forward, I've been retired for 7 years now. And ironically, I didn't retire as an IT consultant. I retired as the arts consultant for the board. And there's a whole dynamic there as well, because I think during these times, and I have a 13 and 11-year-old upstairs working on Chromebooks, working on school-assigned software and assignments. And the series that you've done has really opened my eyes, because it seems benign and it seems like everything is okay. But behind the scenes, I'm really concerned. And I'm concerned where it's taking our children. I'm concerned where it's taking our families. And I'm concerned where it's taking our society in general. So I've been an advocate for many, many years, but certainly this is a different time and a different feel. I'm not sure if that resonates.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. So it's, from my perspective as a cybersecurity professional, I see, and you may have seen this in my various articles about student data privacy. I see the protection of kids' privacy as being paramount, and how it should be something that's untouchable. We can always say, hey, you know what, you implicitly agreed to this and that and the other thing because you're an adult. But when it comes to kids, where we put a computer in front of them and a website in front of them and a tool in front of them that is used and adopted by a school, there should be proper verifiable due diligence, and it's almost criminal, I want to say, when these kinds of boundaries are violated. So as a criminology professor, I wonder, Valerie, whether you look at things through a different lens when it comes to student or children's privacy.
Well, I think all of the issues that you've raised around PIAs and legislation are incredibly important, but they focus on protecting the data more than they do on protecting the child. And I think Stephen's concerns are really rooted in this lived understanding of what it's like to be in a classroom. So I think it's really important not just to look at what happens to children's data when they're inscribed in these systems of education. Excuse me. I think it's also important to step back and look at how it changes their social experience of education. So as much as the COVID-19 isolation is this interesting point where schools are forced to use these kinds of online technologies, we've been flooded with examples of how poorly they work. So one of the research projects we're working on right now is following up with one of our youth participatory action research groups of young people who a couple of years ago came up with a project where they disconnected from technology for a week so they could see how it affected their sense of connections. And we've been working with them and talking to them about how this disconnection from the social world is affecting them, and how technology is playing into, their sense of connectedness or disconnectedness. And it's been fascinating because they're saying things like, wow, if you'd asked me, 3 months ago, if I like going to school, I would have said no. But now I just want to see my teacher. I realize that this computer can't teach me. I want to be in a room with my classmates. I want to have that synergy. And so if we look at privacy from that perspective, I think it's an essential part of the trust relationship between the teacher and the student, and between the student and the classmates, that allows people to come together in a private and protected space and take risks and learn and explore things. And once you make that all capturable through data flows, you shift that relationship in ways that I think are really problematic.
Mm-hmm. And those problems, do you see those problems as being medium term, short term, maybe long term problems? How do you position how do you articulate the impact of those data problems when you try to explain it to the kinds of decision makers, stakeholders, the public, when they try to wrap their heads around what do you mean by privacy breaches anyway? Does it mean that maybe when these children or these students grow up, some of these privacy violations may turn into identity breaches and they'll have no idea how these things cropped up because they'll occur 8 to 10 years in the future? Is that how would you articulate it?
Well, I think again, we're talking about two different things. I think one of the benefits of so many people using Zoom right now is that classrooms have been bombed by ill-intentioned strangers who come in and disrupt the flow of it. So that inability to maintain the privacy of the classroom changes the relationships between the people who are trying to learn. So I think those kinds of examples are actually great opportunities for parents to really get a sense of what it's like to have to sit down in front of a computer for 7 hours and try and effectively learn through it, because we're all living in this really constrained world where technology has so much of a bigger space in our lives. And I think that's particularly true of kids. But when it comes to the identity theft or the long-term consequences, we've been working very hard actually on public education initiatives to help people begin to unpack the system that's behind this. So yes, you could be concerned that your child's information could be used and their identity could be stolen from them in the future. But really, the serious problem here is that all of this data is collected and funneled into an algorithmic sorting process that will determine whether or not that child, when they become an adult, has access to services and employment and dating and all sorts of things. So once we start to capture all this information, it's used in these non-transparent ways to determine our opportunities. And it's that algorithmic sort of a big data environment that we really have to start talking about. And it's particularly difficult because it's invisible. So I think, again, the best we can do is look for those stories where data is pulled into these systems and suddenly schools are being have resources taken away from them in the United States because they're not meeting these very binary standards that have been set by EdTech companies for success. Whereas in actual fact, you could have a fantastic teacher who's working with kids that are at a disadvantage. So if you take that data and pull it out and scrunch it, you're going to be drawing conclusions about that classroom that just aren't accurate if you are sitting in the classroom itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I know that, Chad, you wrote a recent article on raising the alarm about the fact that some EdTech apps are surreptitiously collecting information, and we have no idea, or perhaps parents have no idea about the degree to which big data can be used to slice and dice that information, and perhaps it's just being used to get to know students. But what else can be done with that data?
Well, I mean, that unfortunately, that's almost a bottomless rabbit hole to go into what can be done with the data. But when I talk to people who ask me that question, there's kind of two examples that I give, and they're just examples, but they're real world examples that can come into play. So the first is, let's assume that your kid is completing their initial education and they're applying to a college or a university, and it's a highly competitive university, and they've got about 5 or 10 students who are right on the bubble, and they're trying to figure out, we want to admit the best possible student to our school, but all of these students look relatively the same on paper. How can we get information to be able to figure out, which of these students is the safer bet or the better bet for our school? And so they go to one of these companies who has access to this accumulated student data, and they say, do you have any red flags that you could send me that could give me a little bit more information? And let's say they find that your child, for whatever reason, maybe a grandparent passed away when they were in 7th grade or something, had a bad month or two where they had some disciplinary problems. That gets reported up. And maybe that's the red flag that gets your kid not into that university when another kid does. Another example is later on in life, let's say we have an insurance company. And let's say it's an auto insurance company. And they, with their algorithms and their kind of crunching of the data, make a determination that could potentially be accurate, that individuals, drivers who have disciplinary problems or, say, struggle in school when they are, between 1st and 12th grade, have a 2% greater chance of getting in a car accident, right? That all could be very much true. And so they pay for relatively cheap for their company, considering the amount of money a large insurance company has at play, to find out information about any of their policyholders or prospective policyholders who have had, either disciplinary problems in school or else, say, struggled in math and needed tutoring, or maybe they even conclude that there's a similar line of a link between more likely accidents if you got things like free lunch or other social supports. And they get that information and they filter it in and they charge you higher car insurance rates. You may not even realize why you're getting the higher rates or the fact that you are getting a higher rate, but this insurance company, by paying maybe $50,000, $100,000 for this information, can save itself millions if its algorithms are correct. And that's another way it can come back. And so this information that gets gathered on young kids can be with them for their entire life, and it can have real economic benefits in the market for people to get access to this information. One more example could be a small thing, and it seems fairly benevolent, but, let's say your kid writes an essay about how much they like baseball. 3 days later, they start getting targeted advertisements from sporting good companies. Maybe parents don't feel comfortable with that. So there's a lot of different machinations by which, child's data that gets collected can come back and be used on them or against them later in life.
That's right. And I think maybe you're right. The question is not what can be done with the data, but what can be done with the data today versus tomorrow versus 10 years from now, because that certainly has a big impact on the degree to which this information can be abused. And so our capabilities to exploit or to leverage information in 5 years certainly will exceed those of today. So perhaps that's a discussion around data retention. And I know you and I, Chad, have discussed this data deletion week. Right, this experiment. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that? Simply because it happened in the States, and I haven't seen too much coverage of it.
Yeah. So obviously, there's kind of the input problem, right, which is data collection, and then there's the retention problem, the data retention problem, and I think that really they are two sides of a coin. So in the first instance, when we're talking about remote learning apps, I think we really need to be talking about, having rules and laws in place that limit the collection of data by these EdTech companies to only the data that is necessary for the operation of their app. But even that which is collected can potentially be harmful down the line to kids, and that is where you get to data deletion. Simply because a child and their family has agreed to turn over information to you because they need to in order to be able to use your learning app doesn't mean that they want you to keep it or use it for other purposes. And so you can get into a lot of laws around, opting into use permissions and those sort of things. But one way you can definitely push back is by having strict data deletion laws. And that's kind of this concept behind the data, the data deletion efforts is that, whether it's once a year they have to go in and delete, or whether it's more frequently than that, to have that data not just be able to sit there as if, once collected, all uses are open to the company that has managed to get their hands on it. That has to be changed. And I would say that one of the beauties of a concept like a data deletion week is that parents and kids have to do absolutely nothing for it to be effectuated. It's an automatic thing. There are some arguments that I think are not wrong necessarily, that parents should be empowered to request their kids' data be deleted, and that's not wrong. But with everything that parents have to do, I'm a parent of two young kids, and right now with remote learning, I'm literally overwhelmed with my responsibilities towards work and my children. You don't want to put one more thing on a parent's plate that if they forget to do it, their kid remains at risk. And so that's kind of the beauty of the concept of automatic data deletion and pushing for those efforts, as some people have in the United States, to different degrees of fanfare and success.
And it took a number of lawyers to make that happen, to force that to happen. And the first I saw of it was in a district near Washington, D.C., where parents got together and said, hey, you know what, we're seeing new EdTech being imposed on our kids every year, but there's no discussion about how much of this data is being temporarily collected versus how much is perpetually expected to be handed to these organizations and their partners. And that resonated with me because that was part of the reason we started this podcast. It's because I was concerned about how much data is being collected about my kids using these technology tools that may or may not be properly due diligenced. And I guess my question to Jane, as a professor of law, and in fact, both you and Valerie would be able to comment on this, but in particular, Jane, would you be able to give me an idea of, or give our listeners an idea of whether it would even be theoretically possible in Canada to force EdTech companies to at least once a year delete the personally identifiable information that EdTech at large collects in the scope of public education or within that ecosystem?
What I think is interesting about that is that there's a whole lot of things that we could be doing with tech corporations, including with respect to EdTech, if we were to have the political will to do that. Right. So that's it. And there's kind of two sides, I think, to the coin. One is when you sort of think about the flow of data. One is about data deletion, and the other part of it that really speaks to the example that Chad gave earlier is about data use. So data being used to charge you a higher insurance rate, for example. And what's interesting, has been really interesting, I think, for both Val and I in the Equality Project and in our prior research is the way that the online environment is making it so clear about the connection between privacy and equality, privacy and human rights, because it's the data itself is then being used to profile people, to make decisions invisibly about insurance rates. And in the analog world, there are human rights statutes that deal with whether or not you can charge people prices based on certain characteristics, including things like socioeconomic status, which are often signals in places like North America for other identity factors like race. So we have human rights legislation that prohibits that kind of discrimination. We have privacy legislation that deals with how data can be used or stored or whether it has to be deleted. But really, the online environment brings those two things together, and we're still sitting kind of stuck in our legislative silos, right? Privacy on one hand, human rights on the other. And so I think there needs to be some political will for governments to push forward and not just throw back these obligations on individuals, whether it's educators, parents, children, and turn to the corporations and say, here are the baselines. Here's the baseline for the things that we expect from you if you want to operate in our communities.
Yeah, that's absolutely, and I think it would go a long way to remind people, to remind the public that privacy is in fact a human right, and it has been for half a century. So the fact that we need to be serious about protecting the personal information of those most vulnerable around us, I think should be a political message, and certainly a differentiator, a positive differentiator for so many politicians. Fascinating stuff. And so I want to go around the table one more time and see if we can have some closing thoughts. So I'll start with you, Stephen. And as an educator, what are your thoughts as you're watching this forced modernization and accelerated advances of education and technology working together to essentially the goal here is to improve education, right? So nobody sets out to abuse anything. Nobody's looking for, to stretch the boundaries of morality and ethics. But what, in your interactions with other educators, what do you see as being some of the thoughts and the challenges that they are concerned about? Pandemic notwithstanding.
Notwithstanding, indeed. I think the biggest source of tension for me is interacting with educators who I admire, I respect, who are doing good work, who live in this voice ed radio space and do podcasts based on their passion around EdTech. I want people to step back and take a critical look at not only their use of technology in their classrooms, but their it's not acquiescence, but it's a willingness to become part of the machine, if you will, and to be branded themselves, and to have their students branded in certain ways. I really am conscious of that. I think there is a larger political conversation to be had here, a policy conversation around the role of EdTech from a corporate perspective in our education system. I think I have developed a real passionate eye and a passionate heart for the value of a public education system and a well-funded public education system. And I want to be vigilant in this time of rushing to a solution that we don't sell out that commitment to publicly funded education. So that's a 30,000-foot policy conversation, but it's one I really want to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that ties well into Valerie and Jane's article. Valerie, how does that tie into your recent article where you again sounded the alarm about the fact that privacy is at risk with these rapid shifts that we're undergoing these days?
I think it really reflects Jane's initial point that it's a matter of political will. So legislators are certainly looking up, and there's a nascent conversation around these issues because people are concerned. And I think in Canada, the legislative situation is somewhat different than it is in the United States, because our private sector legislation does allow us to simply shut down collection, use, and retention for purposes that a reasonable person considers inappropriate in the circumstances. So I think since, yes, privacy is a human right, but so is education under the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So a child has a right to education, a child has a right to privacy. And under the CRC, governments have an obligation to protect children's privacy, but they also have an obligation to give youth an opportunity to participate in discussions that affect them. So I think when we do invigorate that policy discussion that Stephen was talking about, it's important to bring in that youth perspective. A couple of years ago, I was working with a group of youth in Toronto, and I did my spiel. We were talking about privacy and human rights and the CRC, and all they wanted to talk about was how frustrated and angry they were because their schools were insisting that they do math homework on a tablet. They said, look, just because some dumb company comes in and gives us this free junk, all of a sudden I'm being told I'm not allowed to do math on paper and pencil, and I have to put my homework in, have to hand it in over this tablet, and it's not working for me. So when we do have that policy discussion, I really hope that we can bring the perspective of young people to the table, because they're the population that we're seeking to serve, and theirs are the rights that we're seeking to advance and protect.
I agree. I get a lot of that kind of comments, not just from students, but from teachers and teaching assistants as well, who say, look, we're being forced to take pictures of the kids' work and post it and publish it on this new page inside the system, which aggregates it and allows it to be dissected and so on. And we just don't see the value of this. And yet the word modernization is being thrown around without much evidence. I wonder, Jane, whether here in Canada, in addition to politicians, changing things or adopting different priorities and so on, are there any other organizations? The privacy commissioners don't have necessarily huge powers of enforcement. They advise and they reiterate best practices and so on. But are there any other associations or organizations or levels of participation that could enact change or at least articulate the interests of students and families?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Val's point, really, there are organizations of youth. There are youth collectives that are associated with various organizations. And I'm actually involved in something that's been kind of organized by the federal government called the Safe Kids Initiative. And what became evident there is that the importance of youth-led, right? So going to those youth organizations, and then when you do that, not treating them like free labor, or like not experts, but compensating them for their time while others who are paid and are sitting in those kind of consultations, making sure that youth participation is accredited and compensated, and that it isn't adults creating something and then trying to get kids to rubber stamp it. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole process there, and I just would sort of want to kind of end off what I wanted to say by just saying, I think this is an important moment in a broader question about this sort of rush to technology and this assumption that modernization or technification of everything is automatically progress. And we've got a lot of people have a lot more time on their hands than they used to have. Other people are busier than ever. But I think it's a really important broader moment for us to avoid doing what Langdon Winter called technological somnambulism, sort of sleepwalking into an era where we just unquestioningly accept that technology is the quote unquote solution to some pretty serious broader social problems.
Yeah. And sometimes there are problems that might be imaginary or created by marketing departments or any number of shrewd salesfolk without much consultation. So I want to end with Chad. Chad, I hear a lot about updates to American privacy law, the U.S. laws that protect student data or were originally designed to do so. What are some of the upcoming refresh? What are some of the proposed updates to those laws? It's crossed my mind that perhaps that's the kind of thing that Canada should keep its eyes on, or maybe just have an international agreement to improve its treatment of student data and the adoption of EdTech and control over data aggregation and collection and so on, in conjunction with other corresponding U.S. authorities. So what are some of the things that have been proposed that you are yourself, that you're positive about and you're looking forward to seeing?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question because where I always start with, when you look at existing U.S. laws, privacy laws, on the federal level are extremely weak in the United States. We basically have heightened protections only for two categories of information: health information, in which I think our laws are fairly good with respect to privacy, and student and child information, in which they're quite weak. I mean, our FERPA law, which is our protection for student educational information, it should be creating a wall to protect student privacy. And really, FERPA in the United States is more of a speed bump. It is quite easy to get around. And so, I would say this. I think the United States, in some respect, is having a bit of a privacy moment writ large, with everything from kind of the problems we've seen around, Amazon rolling out facial recognition, to, Facebook, giving mass amounts of user data over to Cambridge Analytica, to breaches in places like Equifax and Sony. I think people are becoming more and more aware of the extent to which their privacy is at risk in the United States. That applies to kids, and that applies to people in general. The challenge, which interestingly seems to be an American and a Canadian challenge equally, is lack of political will. The problem when it comes to children's privacy in the United States, and I assume it's somewhat of a similar situation in Canada, is that the lack of political will is tied, I think, in large part to the fact that, these EdTech companies oftentimes are extremely well funded, or they're even offshoots of companies like Google, where their product is to teach children, but their motivation is to make money, not to teach children. And so they come into the privacy discussion, whether it's children's privacy or consumers' privacy, with massive amounts of money and political influence, and oftentimes with fake legislation that they will say is privacy enhancing, but really what they're trying to do is get a weak law passed so legislators will not come in and pass a strong law instead. And the entire process is kind of right now in this moment of tension between people becoming more and more sensitive about their privacy and wanting it protected, and what, at least in America in 2020, are our wealthiest and most powerful companies wanting exactly the opposite to happen. Understanding, of course, that they can't say we're against privacy, so they say we're in favor of privacy, but then they push weak laws and non-enforceable internal policies. And so I think what we really need, in the United States is much, much stronger laws on the federal level. And while we're waiting for those to happen, and even after they happen, for our individual individual states to pass laws that create the privacy protections that our Congress may not be willing to pass. That's easier to say than done, but my hope is that, if we keep kind of pressing the issue as strong as we can, and frankly, internationally rooting for each other. If Canada passes a strong student privacy law, that will put pressure on the U.S. to do the same. Much in the way that, the European consumer privacy push has put more pressure, I assume, on both of our countries to act more strongly. So there is an international element to this, but I would say it's not an international law because mostly, at least from the United States standpoint, and particularly with the current president we don't care much about international law. But if other countries pass stronger laws, that does in fact put pressure on us. So I think we all need to do our part nationally with the hope of it being a stronger international push in the long run.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It certainly does come down to the law, doesn't it? And perhaps if international collaboration is impractical, perhaps really just the prospect of setting the example and showing the right approach is really what's needed here. So I want to thank all of you. This has been fantastic. It's a very important topic. We can discuss it at length, but I think we've got a lot of important content that we've packed into today's call. I thank you individually. Thank you, Valerie, Steeves. Thank you, Jane Bailey. Thank you, Chad Marlow and Stephen Hurley for making yet another unique and hopefully valuable episode for our audience. And again, thank you to our audience, because this has been a tremendous arc. We've built this over 10 episodes, and it's amounting to something really valuable. We're going to package it together, and hopefully people will enjoy it, learn from it, and use it for decision support. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Claudio Popa from the Cybersecure Ed podcast, signing out.